Welcome to Revival Waves of Glory. Recently I started talking about Nesara, things about the Federal Reserve, and today I'm going to talk about money in the Bible, Nesara, the Federal Reserve, but also money corruption. A lot of what's happened in our world is because of corruption. And we need to understand that if we're going to understand what God's about to do. As I started the last time, I really wanted to start this one out the same way and let you know that years ago God said that He was going to erase debt, that He was going to begin to bless people, that He was going to begin to cause things to be erased. And this is what is happening. It is happening. No matter what it looks like, no matter what you hear, no matter how high the inflation gets, there is a release coming. Hallelujah. So we're going to talk about Nesara, the Federal Reserve, and corruption. And you can look at the gold back standard in Nesara and the Bible and put it all together. We talked about that last time. And I love doing that part of it. But now, here's the thing that happens. When most people, when they consider the Federal Reserve, they never really heard of it. What is that? Sounds like a federal agency, doesn't it? People are trained, most people are trained to say, you know, money is just boring. I don't study it. I let my financial planner do that, or the banker do that. Doesn't the bank know all about that? Now here's the reality of what's coming. What's coming, as Nesara explains, we're going to get a little bit more into in a moment. But when that comes, you need to change your thought process related to money. You got to understand what our whole concept of the way money is going to have to change. So let's get a little bit background of the Federal Reserve, and that's probably the dullest part of this series of what I'm preaching on, is there's so much history we really need to have an aspect of, because if we don't understand some of the history, we're not going to understand the present and the future. So 1912, April 1912 exactly, is a fascinating time. You know, I've been a Christian for many years, not that long, not since 1912, but you got to understand, I remember studying really deep into things, and sometimes it was hard for me to learn. I was not raised in a background of studious people, but I worked really hard, and I started to read. Even when I was a teen, I would read things, even if I wasn't interested in it. And I really didn't understand things the way other people understood them. But I was getting into the end time process the more I got into it. And there's so much end time preaching that's happening right now, but a lot of the end time preaching doesn't talk about the glorious church, doesn't talk about the greatest revival the world has ever seen. They don't talk about all these different things. They talk about Jesus coming back. They talk about the Antichrist. They talk about the mark of the beast. And all these things are going to happen. But you got to understand, that's not what I want to talk about here. And so whenever I started getting into some of the things of the end times, I started getting into the church is going to be blessed to be able to do the work of the ministry, to be able to have the biggest revival the world has ever seen. And in the past, there were many elites. Even today, they're billionaires. But what's more interesting is they were against the Federal Reserve in the beginning. And we're going to talk about that. Most of them were against the Federal Reserve. Now this is a central bank in which you need to know a little bit of history. As Americans in 1775, let's say, threw over the Boston Tea Party because we had taxation. Without representation, we hated the idea. And by the way, all of us hate that idea too. We hated the Stamp Act. All of these other ways that the Crown was trying to tell colonies what they could do, what they couldn't do, and what they could take from them. So Thomas Jefferson was very against the Federal Reserve. And the fascinating thing is Rockefeller used to say, I don't care who makes the money laws as long as I make the money. That's fascinating. That's a statement that is very fascinating. So there are always, I like to call ebbs, EBBS, that flows from the central bank trying to dictate the money to the people. Now it started to come back with a run in 1907. I'm throwing a lot of information, and if you catch some of it, then I'll be very happy. So in 1912, they had this possibility. They had the Federal Reserve in essence, and you can read about this. There's a book that you can read some of this information about, and I'm just putting it out there. I'm not really one that's going to sell you the book, but I'm putting it out there. You can read this on the Creature of Jekyll Island. It's a very powerful book that gives a background of the Federal Reserve. But there's several others, including Killing of Uncle Sam by Rodney Howard Brown. Now this is really good, and I've only read parts of it, but what I read was very shattering. Now understand this. 1912, you have three guys that are against the Federal Reserve. They die in a boat. Now 1913. We have three candidates. So we have left Taft, Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. All three of the banks at the central banks decided to back all three of them. So whoever won, they won. So they came up with the Federal Reserve, and Woodrow Wilson, on December 23rd, 1913, signs the Federal Reserve enter into law. Congress could at least sort of oversee, but it was a fakeness of overseeing, putting it into law. He would sign it into law that the president could appoint the chairman of the Federal Reserve. But the governors weren't even underneath the chairman, but they had no other backlash, you got to understand, to Congress or presidency. I mean, you've got to know who's inside the Federal Reserve. You have to understand. Do you know who the Federal Reserve is? All the banks. Yes, you heard me right. J.P. Morgan, Bank of England, Rockefellers, all the big boys. They're the Federal Reserve. And they're the ones trying to control America and create such a panic that we have to go into a deep recession right now in 2022. So the things people who are into democratic socialism, socialism in America, communism, capitalism, and all these other isms, they should hate the 1% that is the cabal. Come on, the biggest cult in America, the biggest secret group in America is the cabal. Those that are in our leaders right now are part of this thing. Many in Hollywood, many in our government, the acting presidente right now, and all the goons around it. The reason I'm saying it the way I'm saying it is because we're living in a day like no other. This is the time for this cabal to fall so that we can get back on track as a country that is under God, that is supposed to be free. Hallelujah. But they've set up this process to defraud and take away money sources. And you have to ask the question, why or how do they do this? The Federal Reserve creates the money. They started to bring the IRS. Oh, come on. There's another corrupt company. And I'm calling it a company. The 14th Amendment. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But the IRS was allowed to create taxation upon your wealth. That's it. I mean, what you can bring into that, so I get taxed. It goes to the IRS, who takes their cut because they're working their little thing, right? And then it goes direct over to the Treasury Department, who takes their little cut, a little bit of that, because they're working their thing. And then shunts the money over to the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve gets to take off 6% of the monies every single year. And then they make the cash and reflow it back into the economy. Now when you hear it on the other end, without this part of it, you kind of see it. Wow, the Federal Reserve just helps the money. And they help regulate things. That's what it sounds like. They help flow and devalue and revalue. You know, boost the values. But we have to have, listen to that, the stability that comes with the Federal Reserve. They want to tell you that kind of stuff. But the reality, that's the question, folks. And if ever was a time that we need to understand, reality means everything. A lot of what you see right now going on in the world is not real. And we may get into that another time. There's more corruption than I can possibly explain to you. I could spend hours and hours. But we're going to talk about this in a shorter time frame. What's even crazier is that after 1913 and 1914, World War I starts. And a lot of what's gone on when this World War was a lot of corruption. The fakest beginning of a war with the Archduke of Ferdinand and his wife killed in Sarajevo. Why would that draw in the whole world? Why would the whole world go to war over that? They had Australia, Turkey, Russia, Germany, England, France, later America. Other countries came in, African nations, tasked by the British to come in. It was a great war. This is also called the war to end all wars. What a fallacy. What the Federal Reserve was doing is they were shunting cash to both sides. They would make money inside the creation of weapons. Let's take a side note. Think about what is going on in Ukraine and how much money the United States is sending to Ukraine. And let's go on. Just put that in your pocket for later. All these weapons were so gross, like mustard seed gas, that people would die, be disfigured, and couldn't see anymore. All of this gross stuff that happened, it was a disgusting war. And some people will tell you about 10 million people but it's died, but it's actually more like 30 million people. The 1920s in America had just a massive amount of growth. because they had credit coming into America. But see, it's not good enough to have a devaluation, which is a good thing. I mean, from their standpoint, a devaluation of money allows that money to flow. But you've got to flip it on its side and do inflation. Do an inflation issue which devalues the money. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm saying some things to compare to what is going on right now. When you think of inflation, devaluing deflation increases the value of that money. But here's what happened. February 1929, the Federal Reserve meets, and they just meet. We don't get to hear what happened in that meeting. They met, but there was no record of what was said in that meeting. But you catch that they had a meeting. No notes are taken. They never take notes on this kind of stuff. But here's what occurred. That they did, and it is they took away the money chain. So what they did in essence with the stock market is they had to have a margin call. Here's an example, and I hope you catch this. And we're going to get into some better stuff in just a minute, so hang on. Let me explain. You, in 1929, that house is worth, let's say, $10,000 at best. That was a pretty good house in 1929. So if you have a stock that's worth $5, let's say, and it rises, just say for the heck of it, $10, you have 1,000 shares, and you put only that amount, that say $1,000, but it's really worth $10,000. You got 1,000, only 10% of that $10,000 increases in value in 1920. It increases the value until 1929. It's up to $25 a share. Let's just say. The whole point of this is you have a value and it grows. Simple. October 1929, during the great stock market crash, the bankers come to you and say you have to pay. The last part of you've got to come up with $9,000 of the initial amount. You can keep it. You can wait on $9,000. That's more money that you could come up with. And yet, that's exactly what they did. So my stock would be worth $25, but not anymore. Because everyone's trying to sell. And when everyone's trying to sell, your value begins to go down. Down and down. And then it comes to, penny stocks. And this is when we have the idea of the penny stock. And it could be worth 25 cents. And one of those central bankers buys it for 25 cents. I mean, you have all of a sudden they have thousands and thousands of stock that they bought that went from $25 a share to 25 cents a share, and they buy it all. They try to run bank, cash it out, can't get the cash. You got to understand. So what's happening is a great transfer of wealth from the people of the Federal Reserve to the central bankers. And I don't know about you, but the transfer of wealth that my Bible talks about is not for us to get the rich people rich. It's not time for us to be blessing them more and more and more. The wealth of the wicked is laid up for the righteous. So all this begins to build the great transfer of wealth to the Federal Reserve people, the central bankers, these cabal that now have all the assets, took it from the American people, and we move into a Great Depression. They made the Depression. and they took everything from you and call it good. (1933) comes. FDR, probably one of my favorite presidents in history, except for one thing that he did. There's a lot of information that has to go behind this, but there is, in essence, what he did. He took away the gold standard. He said, you have to turn in your gold. Now it's worth $20.60 an ounce. So if you had $1,000 of gold, you were paid $20.60 an ounce. It was gold back at the time. So you got to transfer that money. Bank of France had $1.5 million of gold in the bank. And they were told, we're going to take the gold. No, you're not. You're not going to take my gold. And it went back and forth, and finally, guess what? They did. They took it. And they gave them $20.60 cash for their gold. So they took their gold from them, and that's where we get the Fort Knox idea. That's interesting. Now, how come in 1934 gold is now $33 an ounce? Come on. These big bank politicians, leaders, take everything from us, and now it's worth more. Why? Because now they possess it. They are defrauding, taking money away from that. It's happening right now in America. They are defrauding us. They have defrauded us for a long, long time. And that's why what's about to happen is going to reverse all of the elite's circumstances. I mean, that's a huge amount of value. So they had this gold that increased in value because few people have it. It increases the value, and we're sitting over here just stuck. The Federal Reserve, our money in 1913 was worth 5% of what it used to be. Why are prices costing so much? The Federal Reserve says it's worth. See, when our value money goes down, it's because the Federal Reserve wants to keep us down. So those that are backed by big banks and politicians and leaders that don't have our best interests at heart. Here's a very simple thing anyone should be able to get, whether you're Republican or Democrat. Most people, when they go into office, for whatever it is, whether it's senator or president, vice president, whatever it is, when they sit in Congress and all these different positions, most people, when they go in, they spent everything they had almost. They may have a value left of $100,000, $200,000, and they sat in office for years and years and years. And now many of those people, like Obama and Pelosi and Biden and Kamala and all these different people, are now millionaires, or even trillionaires, is what God says. So that means they have monies that people don't know about. But they are all rich and wealthy now, and all they did was hold a public office. Should they be rich from a public office? And if they are rich, they didn't get it from their salary. They got it from a lot of what I'm talking about right now. So this is a gross part of it. It's that kind of point. It's corruption, is what it is. So the IRS is part of the corruption, their illegal behavior. The illegal behavior from the officials and departure from the text of the Constitution that was supposed to be. There's no taxation without representation. See, this is a perfect example. This is where Nesara comes from. It's the 14th Amendment, the Section 4. This illegal level of taxation, and it doesn't just tax on cash itself, on what's written in the contract, but now if two people go into a contract and can understand that they have mental capacity, that's fine. To be able to understand, as long as two people and the contract is reasonable, I mean the judge has to do it, but it's reasonable, it's binding. So if I give you $5,000 and you give me 5,000 shares, right? It's a reasonable contract. That makes sense. That's binding. And I don't care if the other person changes their mind on the back end. If you had a deal that was based on that deal, the contract says this. So I didn't give you a refund privilege. It is what it is, right? That's how we look at that. But see, the American people have not heard this part of it. And what makes the debts null and void? Right here, this is what makes the debts null and void. They went into a contract using you and your name, your life, your monies, and they put you into a contract without your say-so. You did not agree to it. This is based on those that have worked their entire lives. So we paid compound interest and the devaluing of our process. I mean, you have to pay so much interest on a 30-year mortgage. There's this amount of interest that is just rarely paid unless you go all the way through the 30 years. See, this is when it starts getting into the good stuff. I'm telling you, they've been stealing from us, and that's why the contract is being called null and void. And you're about to be blessed because of it. Part 2 will be coming soon. God bless you.